A cold wind whipped through the quiet streets as the city settled into its usual rhythm for the night. The faint hum of cars in the distance and the occasional flicker of a street lamp were the only signs of life. Somewhere in the shadows, under a dimly lit alley, a woman hurried down the sidewalk. Her breath came in quick, visible puffs, her steps uneven, as if she couldn't decide whether to run or keep walking. She clutched her coat tighter around her, glancing back now and then, her unease growing with every step. Behind her, faint footsteps echoed. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the paranoia of being alone at night. But the sound grew louder, steadier. She didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm the gnawing feeling in her gut. But when the sound quickened, so did her heart. Unable to ignore it any longer, she turned her head just enough to see a shadowed figure trailing her. Her pace quickened, her boots clicking faster against the pavement. The figure didn't stop. Fear took over. She broke into a run, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned a corner, hoping to lose whoever was behind her, but her pursuer was persistent. She glanced back once more, not realizing a parked car blocked part of the sidewalk ahead. Her foot caught on the edge of the curb, and she went down hard, the impact jarring and sharp. She gasped, scrambling to get back up, but the shadow was closer now, steps away. And then, out of nowhere, another figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, and deliberate in his movements, he stepped into the dim light between her and the man chasing her. His voice was calm but commanding. "Hey! Leave her alone." The man pursuing her froze, clearly startled. There was something about the stranger's stance, his tone, that made him hesitate. "This isn't your business," the pursuer growled, though the edge in his voice wavered. "Walk away," the newcomer replied, not moving an inch. His voice didn't need to rise to carry weight. The two men locked eyes for a tense moment before the pursuer muttered something under his breath and slinked back into the shadows. The woman, still on the ground, looked up at her unexpected savior, her mind racing with relief and disbelief. "You okay?" he asked, extending a hand. She hesitated, then took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His grip was firm but gentle, his gaze steady yet somehow unreadable. She opened her mouth to speak, but words failed her. This stranger had just saved her, a complete stranger, and she couldn't even manage a thank you. Before she could gather her thoughts, a car honked nearby, and the man turned slightly. "You should get home," he said, his tone softening. "It's not safe out here." "Wait," she blurted out as he started to step away. "Why? Why did you help me?" Her voice wavered, the question hanging in the air. He paused, looking back at her, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, compassion, understanding, or maybe something she couldn't quite place. "You looked like you needed it," he said simply, then walked away without another word. The woman stood there, rooted in place, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her. She didn't know his name or anything about him, but something about his presence lingered, leaving her with a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. What she didn't know was that this moment would change her life in ways she could never have imagined. She also had no idea how her next decision, one made out of sheer impulse, would set off a chain of events that would leave everyone speechless. The woman's legs felt weak as she finally began to walk again. She glanced around, half expecting to see the man who had chased her lurking in the shadows. But the street was quiet now, almost eerily so, as if the world itself had paused to let her catch her breath. Her rescuer had disappeared into the night as quickly as he had come, leaving her with more questions than answers. She replayed the moment in her mind, his calm voice, the way he stepped between her and danger without hesitation. Who was he? Why would someone risk themselves for a stranger? She reached her apartment building, fumbling with her keys as she tried to steady her trembling hands. Once inside, the familiar hum of the old radiator greeted her, a small comfort after the chaos of the evening. She locked the door, double-checking it before leaning against it, finally allowing herself to exhale. Her heart was still racing, and her mind wouldn't stop replaying the scene. She sank into the worn couch in her living room, staring at the blank television screen. The man's face was etched into her memory's sharp features, a quiet strength in his eyes, and an air of mystery that she couldn't shake. The next morning, she woke up feeling the weight of what had happened pressing down on her. The fear had subsided, but the questions lingered. Who was the man who saved her? And why did he seem so familiar? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him before, though she couldn't place where or when. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the coffee table. A text from her best friend lit up the screen. "Hey, you okay? You seemed off yesterday." She hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I'm fine," she typed back. "Just had a weird night." Her friend's reply was immediate. "What happened?" She debated how to explain without sounding dramatic. After a moment, she wrote, "Some guy chased me last night. But someone stopped him. A stranger. He scared the guy off." The dots indicating her friend was typing appeared and disappeared several times before the reply finally came through. "OMG. Are you okay? Do you know who he was?" "I'm fine. And no, I don't. He just walked away after." Her friend sent a string of shocked emojis followed by, "That's crazy. Are you going to report it?" She stared at the screen. Should she report it? What would she even say? That a stranger had chased her but another stranger had saved her? It all sounded too surreal. She set the phone down without replying, her thoughts drifting back to the man who had stepped in. There was something about him that didn't add up. The way he carried himself, the way the other man had backed off so quickly, it was almost as if he wasn't just an ordinary passerby. Later that day, she decided to take a different route to work, avoiding the street where everything had happened. But as she walked, she couldn't help scanning the faces of people passing by, wondering if she might see him again. Her curiosity was starting to feel like an obsession. She didn't even know his name, yet he had become a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. That night, she sat by her window, the city lights casting a soft glow on her small apartment. She couldn't stop herself from Googling phrases like "man saves woman from attacker" and "heroic stranger in city." But nothing came up that matched her experience. Frustrated, she closed her laptop, feeling foolish for even trying. Maybe he didn't want to be found. Maybe he was just someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But deep down, she didn't believe that. There was something deliberate about the way he had intervened, as if he had been watching, waiting for the right moment to step in. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Was it possible he had been following her too? No, that didn't make sense. He had stopped the man chasing her. He had protected her. But then why did she feel like there was more to the story than what she had seen? The days turned into a week, and though the incident had started to fade from her friends' minds, it stayed with her. Every time she walked down the street, every time she saw a shadow move out of the corner of her eye, she thought of him. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like their paths weren't meant to cross just once. One evening, as she left work late, she noticed something strange. Across the street, a man was leaning against a lamppost, his face partially obscured by the collar of his jacket. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, but something about him caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized why. It was him, the man who had saved her. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should she approach him? What would she even say? Before she could decide, he looked up, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and then he turned and began to walk away. Without thinking, she crossed the street, her pulse racing. "Wait!" she called out, her voice trembling. He stopped but didn't turn around. She took a few steps closer, trying to steady her nerves. It's you, isn't it? You're the one who helped me that night. He finally turned, his expression calm but unreadable. You're safe now. That's what matters. But who are you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he said, just someone passing through. Before she could ask anything else, he walked away again, disappearing into the crowd. She stood there, her mind racing with questions. Who was he really? And why did he seem so determined to stay in the shadows? The mystery only deepened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't over yet. The encounter left her restless. His answer had only deepened the mystery, and the way he vanished into the crowd was almost unnerving. Who says something like just passing through and disappears? She replayed his words in her mind as she walked home, her thoughts a tangled mess of curiosity and unease. It was as if he didn't want to be found, or maybe he was hiding something. That night, sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened since that night in the alley. Her life had been relatively normal before, but now it felt like she'd stumbled into something bigger, something she didn't understand. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became to find out the truth. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude, fear, or just plain curiosity driving her, but she knew she couldn't let it go. The next day, she started asking around. She talked to a few neighbors, describing the man who had saved her, but no one seemed to know anything. One older woman who lived in her building squinted at her thoughtfully and said, "Sounds like one of those guardian angel stories. Maybe you should just leave it be." But she couldn't. Something about him felt too real, too grounded, to be some kind of myth. And then there was the other man, the one who had chased her. Who was he? Why had he been following her? That part of the story haunted her just as much. What would have happened if the stranger hadn't stepped in? Later that week, as she walked through the park near her apartment, she noticed a group of kids playing soccer. She paused, watching them laugh and chase the ball under the fading light of the evening. For a moment, it was a reminder of simpler times, when life didn't feel so heavy. But then, just beyond the field, she spotted him again. He was sitting on a bench, hands in his pockets, staring into the distance. He didn't seem to notice her, but she felt the same pull as before, the need to understand who he was and why he kept appearing in her life. This time, she didn't hesitate. She crossed the park and stood a few feet away, her heart pounding. "You're not just passing through, are you?" she asked, her voice firmer than she expected. He looked up, his expression calm but guarded. "Why does it matter?" "Because you keep showing up," she said. "First you saved me. Then I see you again, and now here you are. Are you following me?" He shook his head. "No. But maybe you should be asking why you keep finding me." The response caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to argue, but the truth of his words stopped her. Why did she keep running into him? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something else at play? She sank onto the bench beside him, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "Look," she said after a long silence. "I just want to know who you are. I want to understand why you helped me and why you keep showing up." He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. "Sometimes people cross paths for a reason. Maybe that's all this is." "That's not an answer," she said, frustration creeping into her tone. "You're avoiding the question." He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers. "And what if I don't have an answer you'll like? Would it change anything?" The weight of his gaze made her feel like he could see right through her, as if he knew things about her she hadn't even told herself. She wanted to press him further, but something in his expression warned her not to push too hard. Instead, she asked, "The man who was following me that night. Do you know him?" His jaw tightened ever so slightly, but it was enough for her to notice. "It's better if you don't ask about him," he said. "Just stay out of it." "Stay out of what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What's going on here? You can't just tell me to stay out of something when I don't even know what it is." He stood up, his movements deliberate, as if he were forcing himself to leave before he said too much. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Not everyone you meet has good intentions." Before she could respond, he walked away, leaving her with more questions than ever. She sat there for a long time, staring after him, trying to make sense of his words. What did he mean by not everyone has good intentions? And why did he seem so sure she was in danger? Over the next few days, she began to notice things she hadn't before. A black car parked on her street that didn't belong to any of her neighbors. A man in a baseball cap who seemed to appear wherever she went, at the grocery store, outside her workplace, even near her building late at night. At first, she told herself it was just paranoia, the lingering effects of what had happened. But the more she saw, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, as she walked home from work, she took a detour through a busy street, hoping to lose the feeling of being watched. But as she turned the corner, she saw the man in the baseball cap again, leaning against a lamppost as if waiting for her. Her heart raced, and she ducked into a nearby coffee shop, trying to calm herself. She ordered a drink and sat by the window, keeping an eye on the street outside. The man hadn't followed her inside, but she could still see him, lingering at the corner. She took out her phone, debating whether to call someone, her friend, the police, anyone. But before she could decide, someone slid into the seat across from her. It was him. Her mysterious rescuer. "You're being followed," he said, his voice low but steady. "You need to be more careful." She stared at him, her fear mixing with anger. "Who are they? And why are they after me?" He glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. "It's complicated." "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to say it's complicated. I deserve to know what's going on." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're caught in something you don't understand. If you want to stay safe, you'll stop asking questions." But she couldn't. Not now. The danger felt too real, and the mystery too deep. Whatever was happening, she was determined to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant putting herself at risk. Her rescuer's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. "You'll stop asking questions." But she couldn't stop now. Every step forward seemed to uncover more questions than answers, and every answer he offered was wrapped in riddles. She watched as he stood up and left the coffee shop without another word, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as though he knew she wouldn't follow. And he was right, she didn't. Instead, she sat there, staring into the swirling foam of her untouched latte, the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. She had two choices: walk away from this and pretend her life was still normal, or dive deeper, knowing full well she might not like what she found. The problem was, she already knew she wasn't capable of walking away. The mystery had taken root in her mind, and the fear of the unknown was worse than the fear of facing it head-on. The next day, she decided to test a theory. She took an unfamiliar route to work, zigzagging through streets she rarely used and doubling back a few times. It was a longer commute, but she needed to know if she was truly being followed or if her paranoia was playing tricks on her. Halfway through her detour, she spotted him again, the man in the baseball cap. He wasn't trying to hide. In fact, his presence felt intentional, as though he wanted her to see him. She ducked into a busy bakery, her heart racing. The warm smell of bread and pastries did little to calm her nerves. From her spot near the counter, she could see him outside through the window, standing across the street, pretending to check his phone. She had her answer. Someone was following her. But why? When she got to work, she confided in her coworker, a tech-savvy guy who loved solving puzzles. "I think I'm being followed," she told him, lowering her voice so the others wouldn't hear. He frowned. "That's serious. Do you have any pictures of the guy?" She shook her head. "No, but I've seen him several times. He wears this baseball cap and just lingers. It's like he wants me to notice him." "Creepy," her coworker said, pulling out his laptop. "Let me show you something. You can check if anyone's been searching for your name online. Sometimes it's a good way to see if someone's digging into your life." The idea sent a chill through her. She hadn't even considered that someone could be looking her up, but it made sense. She leaned over his shoulder as he ran a search, his fingers flying across the keyboard. A moment later, he sat back, his expression troubled. "There's not much," he said, "but this is weird. Look at this." He showed her a forum post from a few weeks ago. It didn't mention her name directly, but it described a woman matching her description right down to the street she lived on. The post asked if anyone had information about her, with a vague implication that she had something important. There were no replies, but the mere existence of the post sent a wave of nausea through her. "Who would write that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Someone who's looking for you," her coworker said grimly. "And they don't sound friendly." She spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely able to focus on her tasks. By the time she left the office, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. She kept her phone in her hand, ready to call for help if she needed to, but the walk home was uneventful. No man in a baseball cap. No black car. Nothing. When she reached her building, her relief was short-lived. A folded piece of paper was tucked into her doorframe. She hesitated before pulling it out, her fingers trembling. The note was brief, written in blocky, hurried letters. "Stop looking into this. You're making it worse." She stood there, frozen, the weight of the message sinking in. Someone knew she was digging. And they didn't want her to. Her first instinct was to call the police, but what would she say? That someone had left her a vague note? It wasn't enough. That night she didn't sleep. Every sound outside her window felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards a potential threat. She kept her phone beside her, clutching it like a lifeline. By morning, she felt like a shell of herself. But her determination hadn't wavered. If anything, the note had solidified her resolve. Whoever was behind this wanted her to back off. That meant there was something worth finding. She decided to confront her mysterious rescuer again. He had to know more than he was letting on. The only problem was, she didn't know how to find him except for one place. The park. He had been there twice before, and something told her he might go there again. That evening, she went back to the park, walking the paths slowly, scanning the benches and open spaces. Just as she was about to give up, she spotted him, leaning against a tree near the soccer field. This time, she didn't hesitate. She marched up to him, her fear giving way to frustration. "I got a note," she said, holding it out for him to see. "Someone wants me to stop looking into this." "What do they mean? What am I not supposed to find?" He took the note, his expression darkening as he read it. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes, concern, maybe even fear. He folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. "You need to leave this alone," he said, his voice low. "You're in over your head." "Stop saying that," she snapped. "I deserve to know what's going on. Why are people following me? Why did you save me that night? What aren't you telling me?" He glanced around, his posture tense, as if he were checking for someone nearby. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not safe to talk here, he said. Meet me tomorrow. Same time, same place. Before she could respond, he walked away again, leaving her standing there, more confused and frustrated than ever. But this time, there was something else, a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it felt like she was finally going to get some answers. The next day couldn't come soon enough. She spent the hours counting down, her nerves on edge. When the time came, she headed back to the park, half expecting him not to show. But he was there, waiting by the same tree. His expression was serious, his body language stiff. You wanted answers, he said as she approached. Fine. But you might not like them. She stopped in front of him, her heart pounding. Try me. He looked her in the eye, his voice steady but filled with something she couldn't quite place. The man who followed you that night, the one I stopped, he wasn't just some random guy. He's part of something bigger. And you're caught in the middle of it. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They're looking for something, he said. And they think you have it. Her heart raced as his words sank in. They think I have it? She repeated, her voice trembling. What are you talking about? I don't even know what it is. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might brush her off again, but then he sighed, the weight of his thoughts pressing visibly on him. I don't know exactly what they think you have, he admitted. But it's valuable enough to make them relentless. That's why they're following you, why they left that note. They believe you're connected to something or someone they're desperate to find. Her thoughts churned. She tried to piece together anything in her life that could explain what he was saying, but nothing made sense. This has to be a mistake, she said. I'm just me. There's nothing special about my life, nothing worth chasing. His gaze didn't waver. That's what makes this dangerous. They're convinced you're hiding something, whether you know it or not. And they'll stop at nothing to get answers. Who are they? She demanded. Why won't you just tell me? They're not the kind of people you cross lightly, he said, his voice grim. They're powerful, connected, and they don't play by the rules. The less you know, the safer you'll be. She couldn't take it anymore. Frustration boiled over, and she grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Stop telling me to stay in the dark. I'm already in danger. You said it yourself, they're after me, whether I know why or not. So if you want to help me, if you actually care about keeping me safe, then tell me the truth. He hesitated, his expression torn. Finally, he relented. Fine. But you're not going to like it. He motioned for her to follow, leading her away from the busy paths of the park and into a secluded grove of trees. The air felt heavier here, the sounds of the city muffled by the dense canopy above. He stopped and turned to face her, his demeanor shifting. For the first time, she sensed not just caution but urgency in his words. Years ago, there was a man, he began, his voice low. He uncovered something dangerous, something people in power didn't want the world to know. He went into hiding, but before he disappeared, he left behind pieces of what he'd found. Clues scattered and hidden. And now, those who want to silence the truth are hunting for every fragment of it. She stared at him, her mind spinning. What does that have to do with me? He met her gaze, his expression somber. Because you're connected to him. Maybe not directly, but in a way they've traced back to you. That's all I know. She took a step back, shaking her head. No. That's impossible. I don't know anyone like that. I've never been involved in anything like this. Are you sure? He asked. Think carefully. It could be a distant connection, a friend of a friend, someone you met once and didn't think twice about. Or maybe something left behind that you don't even realize you have. She racked her brain, searching for anything that fit his description, but nothing stood out. Her life felt painfully ordinary: work, friends, the occasional weekend trip. There was nothing extraordinary, nothing that could link her to some mysterious conspiracy. Before she could say more, a sharp crack echoed through the grove, like a branch snapping underfoot. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. He moved first, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind a tree. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed her back against the rough bark. She tried to slow her breathing, but fear gripped her tightly. Peering around the tree, she saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, too fast and deliberate to be random. Someone was there, watching them. "Is it them?" she mouthed, her eyes wide. He nodded, his expression tense. "We need to move," he whispered. "Now." They slipped through the grove, careful to stay out of sight. Every rustle of leaves and crunch of gravel felt deafening, each sound a potential giveaway. Her rescuer led the way, his movements sure and practiced, as though he'd done this 100 times before. She followed closely, her heart pounding, her mind racing with questions. As they emerged from the grove and back onto a main path, he stopped abruptly, his hand shooting out to stop her. Ahead, a man in a dark jacket stood blocking their way, his posture casual but deliberate. She recognized him instantly. It was the man in the baseball cap, though now he wasn't wearing it. "Going somewhere?" the man called out, his voice calm but laced with menace. Her rescuer stepped in front of her, his body a shield. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, his tone measured. The man in the jacket smirked. "Trouble's already found you. You should have stayed out of it." She couldn't see her rescuer's face, but she felt the tension radiating from him. "Let her go," he said. "She doesn't know anything." "That's not for you to decide," the man said, taking a step closer. "You've been interfering long enough. It's time for her to come with us." Her rescuer didn't move. "That's not happening." For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the man lunged. Her rescuer reacted instantly, meeting him halfway. The two clashed in a blur of movement, their struggle quick and brutal. She stumbled back, her eyes darting around for something, anything that could help. Her gaze landed on a large stick near the edge of the path. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she held it tightly. Before she could decide what to do, the man in the jacket broke free, his face twisted in anger. He reached for something at his waist, and her blood ran cold as she saw the glint of metal. Her rescuer moved to block her, his voice sharp. "Run!" he shouted. But she didn't move. She couldn't leave him behind. As the man raised his weapon, she stepped forward, gripping the stick like a lifeline. With all the strength she could muster, she swung. The impact sent a shock up her arms, but the man staggered, dropping the weapon as he fell to the ground. Her rescuer grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "We have to go," he said, urgency driving his words. As they ran, her mind reeled. The encounter had shifted everything. This wasn't just a game of cat and mouse anymore. It was a fight for survival, and the stakes had never been higher. They didn't stop running until they reached the crowded streets. The buzz of traffic and people felt like a strange kind of safety, a barrier between them and whoever had been chasing them. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her rescuer scanning the crowd for any signs of danger. For a moment, it seemed like they were in the clear. "We need to go somewhere secure," he said, his voice low but steady. "This isn't over." She nodded, following him through the labyrinth of streets. They ended up in a dimly lit parking garage, the concrete walls echoing with every footstep. It was quiet here, almost too quiet, but he seemed to think it was safe. He turned to her, his expression grim but focused. "Do you understand now?" he asked. These people aren't going to stop. You have to tell me everything, every detail, no matter how small. Something in your past connects you to this. She wanted to argue, to insist that she didn't know anything, but the fear in his voice made her pause. She thought back, searching for anything that might explain why she had been targeted. Then, like a crack in a dam, the memory flooded back. When I was a kid, she began, her voice shaky, there was a man who used to visit my parents. I never knew who he was, but he always carried this leather satchel. I remember because he told me it was very important, like a treasure chest. One day, he came over in a hurry. He was talking fast, arguing with my dad. Then he left, and we never saw him again. Her rescuer leaned closer, his attention razor sharp. What happened to the satchel? She shook her head. I don't know. I was just a kid. My dad put it away somewhere, and we never talked about it again. I barely even thought about it until now. Think harder, he urged. This satchel could be what they're after. Where would your dad have hidden it? Her mind raced. She remembered the old storage trunk in the attic, the one her dad had always kept locked. As a child, she had been curious about it, but he had told her it was just old paperwork. Now, she wasn't so sure. I think it might still be at my parents' house, she said. In the attic. But my dad passed away years ago, and my mom doesn't go up there anymore. He nodded. Then that's where we're going. The drive to her childhood home was tense, every shadow on the road feeling like a threat. When they arrived, the house was dark and quiet. Her mom was out of town, which made things easier and eerier. They entered through the back door, her rescuer moving swiftly, his movements deliberate. She led him up to the attic, her heart pounding as she climbed the creaky stairs. The trunk was still there, covered in a thin layer of dust. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock, finally managing to open it. Inside were stacks of old documents, photographs, and, at the very bottom, the leather satchel. It looked exactly as she remembered, aged but intact. Her rescuer grabbed the satchel and opened it, his expression unreadable as he pulled out a bundle of papers and a small, weathered notebook. He flipped through the notebook quickly, his eyes scanning the pages. This is it, he said, his voice a mix of relief and tension. This is what they've been looking for. What is it? She asked, stepping closer. It's a record, he explained. Proof of corruption, hidden deals, and crimes committed by people in power. If this gets out, it could destroy them. Before she could process his words, the sound of footsteps echoed from downstairs. Her blood turned to ice. They weren't alone. Stay behind me, he said, pulling her into the shadows of the attic. They listened as the footsteps grew louder, closer. A voice called out from below, sharp and commanding. We know you're here. Hand it over, and no one gets hurt. Her rescuer gripped the satchel tightly, his jaw set. They won't stop, he whispered. Even if we give this to them, they'll kill us to cover their tracks. What do we do? She asked, panic creeping into her voice. We fight, he said simply. The next moments unfolded in a blur. The intruders burst into the attic, their faces hard and unforgiving. Her rescuer moved quickly, using the cramped space to his advantage. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby shelf, her hands shaking but steady as she swung it at one of the men. The chaos was overwhelming, but they managed to hold their ground. Just when it seemed like they were outnumbered, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the attic window, and the intruders froze. Her rescuer smirked, pulling a small device from his pocket. I called them the moment we got here, he said. Time's up. The police stormed the house, arresting the intruders and securing the satchel. As the officers questioned her and her rescuer, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and unease. The immediate danger was over, but the weight of what they had uncovered lingered. As they stood outside, watching the police load the intruders into their cars, her rescuer turned to her. "You did good," he said. "But this isn't over. The people behind this are still out there." She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we finish it." He smiled faintly, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, or maybe fear. "Be careful what you wish for," he said. "This rabbit hole goes deeper than you think." As the police drove away and the night grew quiet, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The satchel had been the key to everything, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And as she stood there, the faint echo of a distant memory surfaced, something the man with the satchel had said to her as a child. "Someday, this will matter more than you can imagine." It mattered now. But what she didn't know was how much more it was about to cost her. As the dust began to settle, she stood in the quiet aftermath, her mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. The satchel, once a forgotten relic of her childhood, now felt impossibly heavy in her thoughts. It was strange how something so small could hold such enormous consequences. The notebook and documents it contained weren't just scraps of paper. They were pieces of a puzzle that had already cost lives and could ruin many more. But they also had the power to expose the truth. She looked at her rescuer, who leaned against the edge of the squad car, talking quietly with an officer. He seemed calm, almost too calm, given everything they'd just been through. Yet she could see the weariness in his eyes, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying secrets for far too long. When he finally turned back to her, his expression softened. "They'll be watching us now," he said. "We've made enough noise tonight to attract attention, both good and bad." "What happens next?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. "That depends on you," he said simply. "We can hand this over to the authorities and hope they do the right thing. Or..." He hesitated, searching her face for a reaction. "We take it into our own hands. Use it to expose the truth directly." She thought about it, her emotions a storm of fear, anger, and determination. She hadn't asked for any of this, but now that it had found her, she couldn't turn away. "They'll come after us again, won't they?" she asked. He nodded. "If we go public, they'll fight back harder. But the more people know the truth, the harder it will be for them to silence it." The weight of the decision pressed down on her. She thought of her quiet life before all this, a life that now felt distant and unreal. But she also thought of the danger, of the people who had been hurt, and those who might still be. Turning back wasn't an option anymore. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "We do it ourselves." In the days that followed, they worked tirelessly. They stayed off the grid as much as possible, moving between safe houses and relying on burner phones to communicate. Her rescuers seemed to have connections everywhere: journalists, activists, even a few tech-savvy friends who helped them digitize the documents. It was a world she had never imagined herself being part of, yet she adapted quickly, driven by a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. As they pieced together the story, the scope of the corruption became clear. The documents detailed illegal dealings, bribery, and worse, all tied to influential figures who had built their power on lies. It was shocking and infuriating, but it also lit a fire in her. These were the same people who had sent men to chase her down, who had threatened her life to protect their secrets. Exposing them wasn't just a duty, it was personal. One night, as they sat in a cramped motel room, she looked at him across the small table where they were sorting through files. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have walked away. It would have been easier." He paused, considering her question. "I've seen what happens when people like this get away with it," he said finally. "Good people get hurt. And I've been part of it before, whether I wanted to be or not. Helping you, it's my way of trying to make it right." His honesty took her by surprise, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in him that he rarely let show. She nodded, understanding more than she could put into words. The night they released the story was a whirlwind. They uploaded the documents to multiple platforms, ensuring that even if one site was taken down, the information would still spread. They also worked with a few trusted journalists who promised to report the story widely and responsibly. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending within hours. The public's outrage was palpable, and the authorities were forced to respond. But the fallout wasn't without its risks. As expected, the people they had exposed didn't go quietly. There were smear campaigns, attempts to discredit the evidence, even a few thinly veiled threats. Yet, the truth was out, and it couldn't be buried again. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made, investigations were launched, and the people who had been pulling the strings were finally held accountable. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. She and her rescuer had to remain cautious, knowing that some enemies wouldn't forgive or forget. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking a quiet park, she turned to him with a small smile. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "The truth always is," he said. "Even if it's messy. Even if it hurts." She nodded, letting his words sink in. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The danger wasn't completely gone, but neither was the fear. They had faced it and come out the other side, changed but stronger. As the sun set, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she realized something. The satchel, the documents, the fight, they weren't just about exposing corruption. They were about finding courage, about standing up for what mattered, even when it was hard. And as she sat there, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting, she knew they had done the right thing. She turned to him again, her smile widening. "So what happens now?" He chuckled softly. "Now? We rest. For a little while, anyway." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was enough. And sometimes, enough was all you needed.